Hey everyone, Irene Lyon here, and welcome to this entire world of nervous system health and healing. Today I have a rerun of a lecture, a bonus lecture I did with my husband and colleague Seth Lyon. Now, our topic is the ill effects of dysregulated parenting. And this was a popular one amongst my students and my followers when we did this live. Even my students who have been with me for years said that they gained information that just never landed for whatever reason. And sometimes it helps when there's two people going back and forth talking about their different experiences and prompting each other. So what we talk about in this is a bit of Seth's journey. He and I grew up in very different environments of stress and we could say dysregulated parenting, more so for him. And we talked about his journey healing this dysregulated nervous system, which when I met him was complex PTSD, social anxieties, many addictions, and also irritable bowel, so trouble with his gut. We talk about the difference between healthy shame and toxic shame, and also his journey figuring out how to parent when he was not parented well. So have a listen, have a dive into this chat. It is a little longer. And just a note too, that when we did this live, we were in the midst of registration for my program, Smart Body, Smart Mind. This is my 12-week nervous system rewire program that we run a couple of times a year. The next time we will run this will be in the early parts of 2023. So we do mention that from time to time, and we answer some questions around this program and how it's suitable for folks of all spectrums and really for parents. So this is a very important thing for me and him, is that parents start to understand that their regulation is essential for their children's regulation and the growth of their kiddos' self-regulation. This is whether or not you are yet to become a parent, whether you are one, and even if you are a parent of adult children. There's something for everyone in this talk. I hope you enjoy it. Hey everyone, well, it's morning here, but it might be good evening or good afternoon for you if you're listening to the recording, or if you're in another part of the world here live. It is the 17th of September. It's the year 2022. I'm Irene Lyon. Most of you know that, but some of you might be new, and some of you might be listening to this or watching this on YouTube after the fact. Today, I've got a special guest, my husband and colleague, Seth Lyon, and I'll bring him in a second. As I said, he's a colleague, my husband. We're going to talk about, or he's going to talk about his journey to be where he is today. The topic proper of today is the ill effects of dysregulated parenting, the ill effects of dysregulated parenting. And I must say, this has been a very hot topic the last few years, and it's really gotten on the map, really even in the last week, because there's a, not my book, but a very prominent figure in our world who writes about trauma and the nervous system and disease and illness and addiction, Gabor Mate. Some of you know of him. He just released a book called The Myth of Normal. And I've listened to a few of his podcasts on some big shows. And inevitably, the conversation, what do you think? It always comes back to the kids, the infants, the parenting, the inability for the parent to attune and know what the little kiddo needs. And so I get good shivers knowing that this information is getting out there, because for those that know me and you get into my work, I always bring it back to the example of what would a baby need? What would a baby want? What are they asking for? And the more we can offer that to them and co-regulate with them, the healthier of a human we create. Now, I know many of you are here because you maybe know you didn't have the best regulated experience growing up. Maybe you have kids and you want to figure out how to better help them, maybe help them heal, maybe attune to them. Maybe you haven't had kiddos yet. Maybe you're a grandparent, maybe you're a school teacher, all these things. So it's a very important topic for me, for Seth, and I hope for all of you, which is why we now have 105 people here today. So without further ado, oh, and one more thing, I will put this in here. If you're here now, timely when we're doing this in September of 2022 on the 17th through to the 19th, registration is open for Smart Body, Smart Mind. Some of you know what this is, some of you don't. Quickly, it's a program that I created many years ago. This September, it'll be the 12th time we've run it. It is a powerful course program for teaching you how to build a healthier nervous system, how to become your own medicine, how to restore regulation in your body. And we'll talk about that today when maybe you didn't get it in the first place. It could technically be a parenting course because it really does teach you, the person, how to attune to yourself. And when you attune to yourself, you can attune not just to your kiddos, but the world, your pets, believe it or not, your plants. People that go through this program, they no longer kill their plants, they can grow gardens. And it's because we're all connected and we're living beings and creatures. So that's my quick little plug, just to let you know that that's happening right now. And we will take questions about this course in relationship to your interests towards the end. So I will stop talking. Seth, come on in and just let people know who you are, how you got here, and your journey of nervous system healing.
Oh boy, I could be talking for the next hour if I go through all that, So hi everybody, I'm Seth Lyon. I am Irene's hubby for I guess about 11 years now, almost, somewhere around there. And before I met Irene, she found me, basically excavated me from the woods. I was living essentially in the counterculture for about 15 years. I was unplugged from the world. I lived mostly either by myself, like literally in the woods, spent like 5 years in Hawaii, just camping around, lived in small communities, lived off-grid, basically out of the system. And as far as I knew, that was simply my preference. It was the way I wanted to live. I didn't have much awareness about trauma and how it was impacting me, except for in a very general sense. And I would come to discover later much more about my real motivation for why I was needing to essentially hide away from the world. And it's complex because, and let's face it, there are some things about our world that are not the easiest, that are just kind of toxic and hard and difficult. And it's pretty nice to live, without working much and just kind of being a hippie. It's a valid lifestyle choice, but it also, for me, became limiting. So let me back up a bit and explain how I got there. And so, I grew up just normal suburbia lifestyle, very, moderately affluent, from all, outside perspectives, apparently healthy and normal and good. But there was so much dysfunction within that perceived normalcy. One, my folks split up when I was 2 years old. And ever since then, I bounced from one house to the other every 2 weeks, me and my siblings. So that on its own creates a bit of a, problem with instability and attachment and all sorts of things around friend groups. And it's kind of a weird way to live, but it's become very normalized, that sort of dual parent household, and it can be okay. But for me, I, like many other people, was growing up with parents who themselves were traumatized and dysregulated, and didn't know it. And it was just how things were. And the way that presented specifically for my experience was my dad, on one hand, his house was very tense. He was a very anxious, angry person at the time. He's mellowed since. But yeah, at the time growing up, it was like walking on eggshells. It was like, oh my God, when is the next eruption of screaming going to happen? Am I going to get spanked again? It was, control, very rigid, like a box, and just very, very hyper vigilant. And then at my mom's house, it was like, okay, there was actually much more emotional freedom. I could express myself. I would often go, like the first couple days at my mom's, I would just be pissed and raging. I would like destroy my room. And she was a psychologist and thankfully knew enough to allow me to do that. So I had a bit of a release. But there was other things going on at that house, which I inherited from my mom, which were her patterns, which weren't so much about being very tense and anxious and angry. It was more about sort of collapse, freeze, being dissociated, numb, sort of lethargic, and a coziness in that, if you know what I mean, like this sort of cozy kind of thing. But there was like these also weird emotional dynamics that sometimes would happen, guilt trips and kind of subtle manipulation things. So it was a different kind of experience that at the time felt better, but actually was just as dysregulating. It was just on the other side of the spectrum. So it was like this back and forth, hypervigilance, tension, collapse, freeze, a little bit more numbness. And that's what my system learned growing up was, okay, like these are the two ways I have to be. So that on top of that, I had many really tough experiences. I had a brother who passed when I was 13 of cancer, which I believe was due to his trauma. He was older and had been the perfect oldest son, which I think killed him, essentially. And so all of that and other family ruptures and the normal, just sort of toxic stuff of society made it such that by the time I got into my 20s, I was looking for an out, essentially. And I found that through meditation. That's how I entered into the process of self-discovery, healing, exiting from the world. I got into what's called a Vipassana meditation. I did a 10-day silent sit, which at the time was profound. I had, an experience that felt very much like what you would call a spiritual awakening, just sort of getting in touch with deeper parts of myself. And that's what sort of propelled me on that trajectory into the woods. At one point during that time, I met my first wife and we had a child. And that's when I really started to see that there was, okay, I still didn't really know what was happening, but it was obvious that like, okay, there's some issues here. Because when I had a child, stuff that had been unresolved from my own experiences as a baby and a toddler, all of that started to be mirrored in my experience with my kid. And it was very interesting the ways in which I adapted and responded to that experience of being a dad myself, which we can get into in more detail as we go. But that's sort of the broad arc of my journey to getting here, was growing up in apparently normal suburbia, ending up with complex PTSD, fleeing to the woods, to meditation, to spirituality, to energy work, to all that sort of kind of more esoteric spiritual lens, living apart from the world. And then Irene found me, and for some reason decided to take me in like a little mushroom plucked from the woods. So thankfully she saw something in me there, because I still hadn't really addressed any of my trauma, which she soon found out too. Because as soon as when I met you, Irene, you had just finished your somatic experiencing training.
Yeah.
And so what was interesting is the amount of overlap we had, because through all the practices I had done of spirituality and shamanism and meditation and energy work, there was overlap with somatic experiencing, but I didn't have the intricate knowledge of the nervous system, of the lens of understanding survival physiology and regulation and all of those things, which is what you introduced me to. So that's kind of how we got to where we are now. When I moved to Vancouver, I started doing sessions for myself, somatic experiencing sessions. And I did them regularly, probably for 6 or 7 years, starting off maybe like every 2 weeks for a long time, and then went to sort of once a month. And I'd say it probably took me about 7 years before I actually became regulated and felt safe in myself, in my cells, in this setting, right? That's the thing. When I was in the woods, like I got to a level of like perceived wholeness and health. Like I was sort of master of my world. I ran the kitchen. I was a chef. I was living in this community of this beautiful hot springs resort. I had friends. I was apparently healthy, and what if I left that bubble though? Let's say I went to town, I would have just like crippling anxiety within a couple hours. I'd have to leave. So I had apparent health in the bubble. Now I have actual health, and am able to engage with the world and able to help my clients and teach and do things like this, so it's a journey that took a while. And I had all those tools, all those great tools that helped once I got into the nervous system work. But it wasn't until I got the nervous system work that I actually started to really heal these deep layers of trauma. So that's where we are now.
Thanks, Seth. And just a story that's picking at my mind, so I'll share it. As you said, when we met and then you came and we were living together for the first time, we had an event at the house that we were living in. This was in Whistler, British Columbia. And it was actually a somatic experiencing introduction. Yeah. One of my colleagues came up to Whistler to promote the somatic experiencing work. And for those of you that don't know that this is the work of Peter Levine. It's one of the things that both Seth and I are trained and practiced in. And, it was a very safe, lovely environment. It was maybe only 20 people and we had snacks. And then I looked around when people were arriving and I was like, where did Seth go? He fled the house. He left because he couldn't stay in himself. And can you speak to that, Seth, about one of the things that occurs with a kid, if you can bridge that back, about why you got exhausted and couldn't be with all these different people?
That's right. Absolutely. So one of the things that kids learn, if they're growing up in an atmosphere of dysregulation, trauma, threat, whatever the presentation is, you'll learn to adapt by understanding who you need to be for the environment. Like, who do I need to be as a kid to get not yelled at? Who do I need to be to fit into this situation? Who do I need to be to fit in with this person? So I became very skilled, and many kids do, at reading the environment, reading the person, and shaping myself and my responses in such a way that it accommodated them and the environment so that I would stay safe. It's a very normal adaptation to that kind of situation. So when I was in Whistler, and these people started arriving, okay, the first person's here, and okay, all right, okay, I can be this way with them. Okay, the second person's here. All right. Okay, no, I can do this. I'll be this. Okay, fourth person, fifth person. How do I shape myself to be okay with all these people so that they don't kill me? Essentially, that was happening. What was happening in my nervous system, right? Every single person is a potential threat that I have to navigate and figure out how to be, which is freaking exhausting. And so, after about the fourth person showed up, I was like, nope, see ya. I'm out of here. Went and got myself like a liter of beer and like drove up to the top of the subdivision and just like drank it and waited. So that's that. And that's the result of the adaptive responses that I learned, which I had never gotten to uncover and work with.
Thank you. Yeah. And, to tie this into kids and humans, one might think that that's normal. And there's a lot of folks here saying, this was me, this was me, this was me. Right. Someone just said, I became an amazing salesperson because you can adapt to all the different, and it's true. There are adaptations to this. But from a nervous system perspective, the system is in threat, in defense, in armoring, in softening, as though, that person's a little more soft-spoken, so I have to change. And then you, Seth, and of course for everyone else, you hit a circuit breaker where it's like, I got to shut down. If I don't get out of here, I'm going to blow steam.
Too much computing, cannot compute anymore, because there was no ability just to relax and be myself. Like, I didn't know what that was. All I knew was all these layers of strategy and management, right? So the idea that I could simply, too many tabs open in the brain. That's great. It's like, I didn't understand how to just like be myself and that would be fine. I didn't have to change who I was. I didn't know who I was, essentially.
And that ties into this word we often hear called authenticity. and being our true human nature and our true soul, if we want to use that word, and our individuality as opposed to our personality. I talked about this earlier this week in another class, and that upbringing that you had, where you had to be a chameleon, as someone said, in your different environments. A, you didn't know any different, and B, it was just life, and C, it kept you safe.
That's right.
So I want to really highlight to those who are maybe still dabbling with this in their world, this was an adaptive response to keep you probably safe when you were quite young. It's actually a good thing that that occurred. But what we know now, as you did, Seth, and maybe you can talk about some of the symptomology in a second that you have healed. We know through quite a bit of research that when a little person is faced with abuse, adversity, neglect, this lack of connection and attunement and not being able to be who they are, express their emotions, if that is not healed later in life, and Seth has expressed this, he tried the meditation route, the being in hot springs route, all the detox practices, but it did not hit and get to these fight, flight, and freeze responses that were keeping his little 2-year-old self and 3-year-old self and 10-year-old self safe. And so just to put context to like the reality, because you look great now, Seth, you're obviously here and not changing yourself, but what were some of the symptoms and syndromes, if you can give them out to people, just so they see that complex PTSD isn't just from war, and it's not from big, I mean, you were in physical abuse, but I also know that it wasn't as horrific as some of the people that we've heard who have been in violence.
Totally. No, it was normal. Like I was spanked, and up to probably too late. I mean, there's no good age for spanking, but I was spanked like, for a few years. There's a period there. But, that is, I was being hit. So, spanking is a nice socially polite way of saying how to hit your kids. So it's still, not good, but not nearly as horrific physically as what some people experience. That's for sure. The horror that I was experiencing was more in the air, like in the energy, in the feelings that weren't spoken, the rage that was simmering under the surface, the sense of violence that could erupt at any time, the sort of cloying dependency, weird attachment stuff with my mom. Like it was more subtle. But the thing is, over time, when you're steeping in that kind of stew, it has the same kind of effect overall as if you're in a war, if you're in, I mean, everyone has a unique presentation, but it's not about how big or little the event is. It's about how do you adapt? How do you respond? How long does it go on? Do you get the support that you need? All of that kind of stuff. So I had symptoms like, one, debilitating social anxiety, like I said, like a really just very hard time being in the world, being in just sort of the normal 9-to-5 job kind of deal. Also had depression that was more physical than mental. Like I was very collapsed in my body. My spine was very hunched. I had chronic bowel issues, IBS, alternating diarrhea or constipation, just never smooth with the digestion, chronic pain and tension as well, addiction, to manage all this stuff. Thankfully, I never ventured into too scary territory with that, mostly just weed and alcohol, but also addicted to various patterns of like isolation, needing to isolate, needing to have a strict control around how much time I spend with people. So, these types of things, not so much flashbacks as sometimes may think of with PTSD. Didn't really get intrusive thoughts or that kind of thing. So it was a slightly different presentation than classic PTSD. But someone just asked if this will be recorded. Yes, it will be.
The other thing too, sorry, Seth, the other thing too, you were born premature.
Yes. Well, that was the foundational trauma. I was born 6 weeks preemie and spent a few weeks in an incubator, which is, that's a profound attachment rupture and trauma. I often said that I would I was basically trying to go back to the incubator for the rest of my life, like that was the template that was set. I'm alone in my bubble and it's safe, right?
Yes.
And I don't have the attachment, but that's okay. I've got, my things to soothe, right?
Yeah. Thank you. What I'd
Yes,
like to
emotional flashbacks. Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, I didn't know that's what they were, but yes, absolutely. And I would replay stuff with my coworkers, like when I was living at the hot springs. We worked, it wasn't like a a high stress job really, but we worked and we had, a team and coworkers, and I totally would like play out, replay different emotional relational dynamic situations with coworkers. Absolutely.
One thing that I want to point out, because some people here might be wondering, wow, 7 years. It took you 7 years to regulate. And some people know this story, but I'm going to lay the context. Then if we could maybe go into some of the biology of how we within Smart Body, Smart Mind, in this healing world that you and I are in, how that shifts these unsafeties, these dysregulations. But this is a true story. We think it was maybe 4 years ago when this occurred. I think it was very difficult for you to sleep in our home. If I was rummaging around during the day, or if it was even at night, and if I was like making a cup of tea and I dropped something, you would instantly, like in the early days, that wasn't good.
Yeah.
And of course, you were never abusive or anything like that to me, by no means, but it caused you the inability to settle and rest.
Yeah.
And do you want to just sort of speak to that from a nervous system point of view? And also that, you still were gaining progress at that level, but these things, they fall in different places. And one thing that often keeps people from doing this work is they are waiting to feel safe before they start it. So can you take that topic and expand?
You bet. Yeah. You really can't wait to feel safe to start it, because that's what you have to build in the first place. And it took me, 7 years before I had an experience of realizing. The first experience was actually in a bath, where I was like, in a bath at home after being out. Irene was upstairs, and I was just realized, holy shit, like I just am chilling and I hear her walking around up there, and that's fine. And then it was like, maybe a few days later that I actually like took a nap while she was upstairs having a call. Her desk that you see her at right now is right above my bedroom. So, and I was just laying down and I could hear creaking and stuff, and I just fell asleep, no problem, just felt safe at home with another being there. And yes, that took many, many years. But the thing is that it's like there's improvements the whole way, right? It's not like work 7 years, okay, now everything is good. That's not how it works. There's little gains, little improvements, sometimes big gains, big breakthroughs, big realizations, symptom changes, the whole way through. I would say that, when I first started doing this work and living in the city, like I had a very hard time even with the idea of like making money, of money in general, of working, of any of this kind of stuff, right? That's stuff that shifted pretty quickly as I started to get a little bit more in touch with my authenticity and realized that I really liked this work that I was experiencing. I wanted to do that work, and like, wow, that was new. I want to actually do work. Like, I want to help people with this. Wow. So that was super early on. That was in a few months. And that put me on the path of doing the training. And then that increased, right, my sense of capability and competency and purpose. And, symptoms started easing and changing. I became more aware of my hypervigilant nature, that kind of thing. That's what is that you'd asked, for me to go into the nervous system a little bit. That inability to settle, that inability to rest when there's any noise or person, that's hypervigilance is what we call that. It's your little brain stem and limbic brain just being like, oh, I don't know, like there's a threat here somewhere, even though you logically know it's my wife, I love her, it's not a problem. But the nervous system and those primitive parts of the brain are like, person, threat. So That's what's going on there in terms of the physiology. So yeah, I don't want to make it sound like you have to, and one, we don't know how long it'll take. Everyone is different, everyone is unique. But there can be big shifts and improvements in your symptoms, your understanding of yourself, your sense of ease, your emotional patterns, your relational dynamics. Things can change pretty rapidly, but it also is a journey. This kind of work is, once you start it, it's not something that ever stops, I don't think, because it's fundamentally about relating to yourself and the world differently, to people differently, through a different lens. And that lens is something that I think you can always polish. Right? You can keep on refining that. You can keep on having deeper understandings, deeper perceptions. But yeah, you get to a point where eventually you're just kind of okay, And for me, that was about 7 years where it was like, okay, I'm just at ease, essentially. Most of my symptoms were resolved, and I was just able to be okay in the world.
And one thing, for those here that might be in relationship, partners, spouses, husband, wives, all that, one thing that was very, I feel, important for our interaction, I called you out on a lot of stuff.
Well, and this is where we can bridge into the parenting thing.
So let's go into that, because I want to get into parenting and shame, healthy shame, toxic shame a little bit, because there's sometimes this thought that it's just about feeling and going with the flow and not being challenged. And man, I challenged you. And in a lot and other relationships where both partners don't understand, this is where it's hard when one person understands the nervous system stuff and the other person doesn't. It can cause a lot of friction. But because we were on the same page, I could point out his hypervigilance. If we were, say, at a restaurant, I'm like, Seth, you're staring at that table. Stop. Stop. And I would have to sometimes hit him under the table. You're doing that thing again. Because the people next to us would be like, what's this guy doing? It's because he was looking for danger. Like, are these people going to come over and jump us? So do you want to speak a little bit to that in relationship now to parenting and such?
Yeah. Well, one, in relationship in general, if you are blessed enough to be with someone who sees your stuff and calls you out on it, like, that is fantastic. And really, I want to encourage you to have humility and embrace that, because it's so important and it's so valuable. And it's going to ruffle your feathers. Like, prepare for feathers to be ruffled, and it's okay. It's important to get that feedback. It's what helps us grow. And this really, reached an apex when my son, who was 16 at the time, came to live with us for a couple of years. Now, I had an on and off parenting with my son his whole life. I was always in his life in some way. When I was living in the woods at the hot springs, he would come spend the summers with me. I tried to live in Wisconsin for a couple of years. I did actually suffer a bit there, and so I could be with him though, and I was glad I did that. But we never had long continuous time together through normalcy. It was always like summertime, holiday time, right? So to have him for 2 years in the last 2 years of high school was such a fantastic opportunity, which I was so thankful for. And oh boy, did that change the dynamics in our house, right? Because then Irene, who had a very different kind of parenting, which had its own issues, which she discovered later, right? But it didn't have the kind of toxic aggression and shame and weird sort of guilt trip stuff and violence that I grew up with. It was very different. So she saw patterns in me and my parenting that I couldn't see. And, this is a very important point, because Irene's put out material before about parenting. And oftentimes what we'll get is angry comments from parents, like, how dare you speak about this because you're not a parent? Well, it really doesn't matter, folks. Sorry. As a parent, it's true that someone who isn't a parent can't necessarily understand the intensity of the emotional, energetic impact of that relationship. But that doesn't mean that someone like Irene can't see what is valuable, what is helpful, what is not, what is attuned, what is misattuned, what is supportive of regulation, what is not, right? That's really something that you just have to understand physiology and trauma to really have a good lens on. So she had that lens, and pointed out all the stuff that I was doing. The main thing that I did, which I was guilty of, was what's called, over functioning, overdoing. Basically, because my relationship with my dad was so fraught with intense criticism and anger, I steered far away from anything that might bring me and my son into that territory, which meant just doing everything for him as much as I could, trying to make his life as easy as possible. And you know what? That actually isn't that helpful, I discovered. By the time I discovered that, he was 16 already. And that, is another issue, because really the changes that I needed to embrace in my parenting needed to happen earlier. And so some of the damage was already done in terms of his ability to manage his time, accomplish tasks, be organized, be on time, like these sort of executive function types of things that would have been very helpful to have me as a parent, or his mom, he didn't really get it from either of us, modeling, right? He had great attachment and early childhood experiences, like the first 3 years were idyllic in Hawaii, just, paradise. But as he got older, and the effects of my parenting and also his mom's, it resulted in some problems for him. So by the time we got him, there were these patterns that I didn't know were patterns, that I didn't think were problems, that Irene started to point out. And yeah, it was not easy. I fought back many times, right? It felt, and this is what someone who isn't a parent maybe can't understand, is how intense it feels to challenge those patterns. Like, yeah, so, I may understand on a cognitive level, you're right, but you don't understand. It feels like I'm going to die if I do that. If I tell my son he has to clean his room, if I tell my son he has to bring up his dishes that he's been accumulating down there, if I tell my son that he has to help out and keep, clean this or do this, that feels like I'm going to die. Like literally, like I can't, like, you crazy? Like, no way. That's how intense it was. And maybe some of you can relate to that. So that was my reaction, is sort of like a flip side of what I had received. At the same time, I also had triggers into the kind of anger that I received. This wasn't so much later, but earlier on, like when he was young, mostly when he was a toddler, when he was kind of wild, exerting his boundaries, I would get triggered into this intense rage, which thankfully I was able to keep contained or go away. It didn't let it into the picture because it was too important to me to protect him from that kind of energy, but it all got triggered in me. So, there's different things that can happen when we're exposed to these problematic parenting things ourselves. One, we can respond in the opposite direction, right? And in our behaviors, but also we can get those direct triggers of like tension, rage, explosiveness that were unresolved in ourself from the same age. Right? So all of that was going on. Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm sure there's folks here that are on different spectrums. Maybe you've had your kids and they're adults. Maybe you have them and they're little. Maybe they're teenagers. Maybe you haven't had them yet. I'm thinking of, and may I share, that's the story that happened in Baja with the healthy
shame.
Yeah.
That's great.
So your son was younger, and I think he was maybe 11.
12.
12. And we were staying in a lovely place on the beach in an area of Baja, and we were coming back from the beach, and Seth and I were talking, having a conversation, and his son interrupted me. And I snapped in a healthy shame way, and I said his name. I'm talking to your dad. Please wait. I was very firm. He teared up. He ran to the house, which was only about 100 meters away. I was like, wow.
Yeah, that was a new experience for him.
He had never been challenged like that.
Yeah.
We get back, and then that night at dinner was the first time he actively engaged with me and wanted to talk to me. it was very interesting and not something that either of us knew was going to happen. But I share that because even though he was already a young teen and hadn't had any boundaries, his brain was looking for that direction. He was looking to be put, this is going to sound weird, in his place. He didn't know how to stop. It was very impulsive. And so this idea of healthy shame, and maybe we can touch in and define the two, Seth, in a second, is so essential. And you can start it even when they're older. Maybe a little different if you have adult children, but when they're still dependent on you and young, gosh, they're looking for that boundary. They're confused if they don't have structure and routine. Of course, the kid also has to be exuberant and do their things, but there needs to be something that says no. And it just showed that the wires were still there in him. I'll never forget it. It was
amazing to watch that happen. And like, to me, it was horrifying at first because I was seeing the emotional response, like, oh no, he's upset. And this is what's so difficult to understand sometimes, is that our kids can be upset emotionally and be getting exactly what they need developmentally in terms of their nervous system and their wiring, right? If sometimes they're going to be upset, and that's okay. If it's in response to something that's needful and healthy. And that's where, you're talking about this idea of the shame response. Now, someone like me, I was toxically shamed over and over and over again for who I was, for my ideas, my dreams, my thoughts, my creativity, my personality, my sexuality. I was shamed in horrible ways. And what we mean by toxic shame is I was told that I was bad. I was told that my feelings, my nature was bad. And that's what we don't want to do. That's so destructive. That's what happened to me. That's very different from a clear communication that says that behavior is dangerous. That behavior is not good for the tribe, essentially. Like, this is where this comes from. How do we maintain the health of the tribe? You don't go poison the well. Don't do that, right? So a healthy shame response isn't something that a parent does to a kid. It's a physiological response that happens in the child that tells them that behavior is dangerous and I shouldn't do that. We call it shame because that's what it is. If you think about the classic example, a kid about to go touch a hot stove, a little toddler, and mom says, she can't get there in time. No, Johnny, no. Right? Like, and whoa, right? The kid will retract generally, and then there'll be like a collapse, right? And sort of the tail will tuck a little bit, the head will come down, they'll tear up, there'll be a collapse in the posture. That's shame. That's the shame response. It needs to be immediately followed by healthy connection. Johnny, it's okay. I love you. I'm just trying to keep you safe. That's a hot stove. It'll burn you, right? It needs to be very clear that the behavior is dangerous and I love you and you're okay. And, everything is okay. But that's a dangerous behavior. So what Irene did was basically that, but it was in a relational thing, like, hey, that's not okay to interrupt someone when they're talking. And she wasn't mean, she didn't really raise her voice. It was just extra firm and clear. And it produced that same kind of response, even though he was, like 12, there's these wires that got linked up, and right in that moment of like, oh, that's not okay to do that. And even though he was upset, his system holistically sensed, I really needed that. And then there was this engagement at this new level with Irene at dinner and this increased closeness. So that's a sort of a summary of how that works and how problematic it can be for someone who's been subjected to toxic shame to assert themselves in that way with their kids. And this is why it all circles back to, as parents, we have to do our work. This is the foundation of being a good parent with our kids, is understanding first how to attune to ourselves and understand ourselves and start getting the old traumas out of our system, becoming more regulated so we can model that. That's the most effective thing we can do. Step one is dealing with your own stuff. And it's really never too late to do that. I have worked with parents of adult children who, as they resolve their stuff, the whole family system changes. It happened in my family system. it's a kind of quantum effect that I don't think we fully understand, but I've seen it over and over and over again. So it's like as you change yourself, you change the system that you're a part of. It ripples out. So
thank you. Yeah. There's a question I'm going to read here, and then I want to speak to a few things, or maybe I'll add this in. So when we have had the upbringing that you had, Seth, right? So me saying that to your son didn't even have to think about how to say it. It's bred into me because I did have a safe early childhood upbringing. Thank you, parents.
And boundaries, like you had that experience with your dad.
Oh yeah. The good here. So someone said, can you give more examples of toxic shame versus healthy shame? So for me, my biggest example, I just got a little head buzz because when I think about it, I'm so thankful. I don't know how old I was, but I was old enough to stand at a very low kitchen table that we had at my childhood home, and I was cutting something, and it was abnormally low, this table. And I guess, I don't remember, but the knife, I think, was facing my face as I was cutting something. And my dad was at the kitchen table, and I heard this very, very loud, but not aggressive baritone, Irene, look at what you're doing. And it startled me a little bit. And I was like, oh shit. I mean, I probably didn't say, oh shit, when I was that age, but I was like, uh-oh. And then he waited for me to see. So he paused. That was his way of connecting. Turn the knife around. You might hurt yourself. Oh, turn the knife around. To this day, if I'm a little rushed, because that happens, and I'm cutting something and I'm doing something that might hurt my hands, I hear his voice and I go, oh, right, silly me. But I'm not degrading myself. Toxic shame would have been him saying, hey, you're such a stupid kid. Look at what you're doing. Like I just changed my tone. You're, what are you thinking?
How don't be an idiot,
like, come on. And it's like this harshness. I bet that there's folks here out of 153 who have had that kind of tone to them, or how you're so stupid. How come you can't get a better grade? Versus, okay. I never in my life of almost flunking out of all of elementary school, and this is a true story, and junior high, never did my parents say, you need to do better, Irene. They just saw my report cards, didn't say much about it. And it was up to me to figure out. The teachers thought I was disabled. I was deaf. I was just bored. But they never took me to another specialist. They never tried to figure out, why can't she do basic math? Well, it turns out I can, but I had to get to calculus to do it, right? It didn't compute. So any other examples, Seth, to help this person see the differences between toxic shame and healthy shame that maybe are coming to your mind?
Well, it's about communication, right? It's about clearly, when there's a problem, something's happening, it's a problem, either because it's going to put the kid in danger, or it's rude, it's something that is disrespectful or dangerous to the group, right? It's about communicating that clearly with closeness. That's all. And again, when you do that, the child may have a physiological shame response, a little change in the posture, a little sinking feeling. And that's a somatic cue that says, hey, that's dangerous. And that's all it's meant to be. And there's no like, I suck involved, right? Toxic shame means you end up feeling like I suck in some way.
Can you distinguish guilt? Because I know that
guilt is mental. Is how I distinguish. Like, guilt is thinking about all the stuff you supposedly did wrong, which, there's a place for guilt. There's a place, and if you do something that's really awful to somebody, there's a place for really checking yourself and thinking about that and feeling a little shameful about it. But when someone is compulsively guilty or feels guilty all the time, that's generally a mental representation of toxic shame, of being toxically shamed, where there's just this imprint of like, I'm wrong in some way, and I will apply that mentally to whatever situation I can, because that's what's circling around in there.
The other thing too that's really important with toxic shame and healing from that, as we've said, it's coming back to the nervous system, healing it, growing capacity, becoming comfortable with our healthy aggression, and feeling a very distinct emotion called disgust is in some ways, and I'm stealing from Peter's words, in that working with disgust and being able to sense that is the gateway to healing toxic shame. Yeah. And in many ways, if you've never experienced healthy shame, this might seem a little confusing. Yeah. Because you couldn't imagine doing what I did and saying what I said to Seth's son, and that's okay. Yeah. It takes time. Just like if you've never ran a mile, you won't be able to run a marathon tomorrow. You need to build up the capacity to feel something that was maybe never there before. But trust me when I say we're wired evolutionary wise to be in a tribe and protect the tribe from danger. And this is where that comes into. Anything else you want to add to that before we get into some questions, Seth?
I think that's pretty good. Yeah. Okay. I mean,
great.
We could talk about other things that are, there's all sorts of important things when it comes to parenting in a trauma-informed way. It's not just about these boundaries and understanding, this is there's, supporting your kids' authenticity. That's incredibly important, but also within a boundaried way, right? So it's not just totally uncontained. There needs to be that beautiful dance between just really staying out of the way of their unique, beautiful authenticity, but also providing a container. Being comfortable with your emotions, all the emotions, especially like you were talking about aggression. Lots of parents freak out when their kids start displaying aggressive behavior, which is totally natural part of development. And there's a way to support that in healthy ways. But if we are ourselves not comfortable with our own aggression, or we've only ever witnessed unhealthy models of it, like I did, then it can be very hard to have capacity for our kids' natural aggression. Like my son, I'll never forget my son, like I said, his first 3 years, we were living in paradise. We were hippies, barefoot in Hawaii, just living the dream, no stress, like no TV, no devices, no nothing, right? 2 years old, he picks up a stick and is like, choo choo, like, where the hell did that come from? It's wired in. It's this natural aggression, and it's a masculine energy. And I don't mean that like male. I mean just like masculine archetype kind of energy that's driving forward, that can present in boys and girls of all kinds. It's a natural aggression that comes up. But if we're defended against our own aggression, our own anger, that's still buried in there, that can be really triggering for us as parents, and like think, oh, that's destructive, but give me no playing with guns, that's horrible, when he's just discovering something about himself, right? So understanding these things cognitively is super important. Working through them within yourself is super important, both things. And just to be clear, when Irene first started talking to me about this idea of healthy shame, I was just as defended against it as I imagine many of you might be feeling. I was like, no fucking way. I'm like, you are crazy. That's awful. Right? So it's just because I hadn't dealt with that in myself. I didn't understand the nuance of what she was talking about. I couldn't feel it. I couldn't understand or feel it. So it's a total natural thing to be defended against some of these ideas. And if you find that, just know that's totally understandable. I was in the same boat.
Yeah, you didn't have a map for it.
No.
There was no map, no written code in your system, but it was there waiting to be sparked. Yeah. And that's a big part of a lot of this stuff, is when your capacity is built, you start to feel healthy impulses of anger and frustration and boundaries and protection that maybe were never there. This classic, people are always walking all over me and poor me. It's like, well, that's because there isn't a healthy boundary that says, stop walking all over me. No. Right. And again, if our kids, or if you as a kid were never told, no, that's not right, in a healthy way, you won't have that connection to healthy life force energy. So all these things really intertwine in a beautiful way. I'm going to read one question here. Someone asked, curious if the nervous system work substitutes any of the any of the somatic or cognitive work. For example, conflicting attachment styles. So I'll say one thing, and then Seth, if you want to get into this. So nervous system work, I realize I don't define it. It is somatic work, and it's also cognitive work, because the nervous system is connecting to all of our physiology, how we think and how we relate to the environment. So at least for me, in the way I've created Smart Body, Smart Mind, we're not just working with the felt sense, and we're not just working with the limbic system that's firing, because there are courses that will just work with that and just work with this and just work with this. We do our best, and I think we do a pretty good job at bringing them all together. And then a funny thing happens is that some of the, the cognition starts to shift, the somatic starts to shift, the nervous system starts to shift, and then the attachment shifts. So if you want to tackle the attachment a little bit, Seth.
Yeah. I mean, some of the attachment repair, there's many ways that happens. So yes, it happens, and this isn't true of just attachment dynamics. All relational dynamics and behaviors shift naturally as we get more regulated and resolve those survival energies that were fueling the dysfunctional relational patterns in the first place. And there's a organic trend towards wholeness and health that is in the human system. It has a template in it for like how it wants to be, that I believe is always there. And as we start to return to that natural state of wellness and goodness, a lot of the things that people go to specialists for decades, they just resolve all on their own. Like these attachment things, addictions, behavioral problems, various diagnoses of all kinds that various specialists could and do prescribe all sorts of medications for. All of these things start to just resolve on their own because they're all rooted in fundamentally those unresolved survival responses and all that ripples out from those. So it is attachment work. It is parts work. Like there's the internal family system, right? That goes quite well with somatic experiencing because you're already doing that. When you come into your body and maybe you find through sensation, oh, here's this layer I just discovered of me when I was 2 doing that thing. I found that in this part of my lung, right? By noticing this, and that's why I was exploring my felt sense. And then there's this sense of me that arises. So that's like my psyche, and also my emotional body, my energy body from that age is surfacing into my being to be discovered and resolved. All these things are happening multidimensionally. But the foundation of it is by learning to listen to and understand those survival responses and those parts of the body where we may not be feeling at all, or we may be feeling too much. For myself, there was many just somatic chambers that were closed off. When I was talking about depression, how I was depressed, but not really in the classic sense, it was a somatic depression. Like we're literally chambers in the body were constricted, depressed, not having flow or life force in them, right? So it's all very interconnected. The things that you discover in your body, that you discover in the nervous system patterns, then play out and relate to the psyche, to the behaviors, to the relationship patterns.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a question that's a good follow-up to this. Can we purchase an in-person SBSM experience? I'm not sure exactly what this is, but the next part is, this brings up fears and cognitive contempt versus in person. Virtual feels less transformational and authentic. And I understand that. But please, Seth, do you want to tackle
totally
this?
So
it's important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, let's right at the start, let's say, okay, maybe this isn't for everybody. Some people will really need that one-on-one relationship with a practitioner. And even if that's the case, you will be far better prepared for that experience if you start to understand and work with yourself in this way. And the thing is, I don't know, but everyone's different. For me, the ability to practice in my own home, in my own space, with some of these things is far easier than with a practitioner, especially if I don't really know them yet, right? Like I did so much, like I spent years exploring myself to even get ready for therapy, like with a, with a person. So it's like, it depends on your history and what you need, but for many people, being able to explore themselves in the comfort of their own home without going to a strange place to meet with a person they may not know, that especially if you've had early developmental trauma like me, or like just the world is unsafe in general and this is my safe bubble, that can be a very nice place to heal from. And that's what we offer, is this sort of comprehensive education and practices so that you can start to explore yourself at a pace that feels right to you without feeling pushed, in an environment that feels good to you, so that it can be a safe process. It's about building that within yourself. So that's another important point, is that we can develop healthy attachment with ourself. Like we can develop that therapeutic relationship with ourself. And that's why we say become your own medicine, become your own therapist, become your own practitioner. Right? That's what we're trying to help people do. So, and yeah, maybe it's not for everyone. Some people may just want that in-person relationship.
And I want to, yes, there are some folks I have found that are like, I know I need to be with someone and be guided. Mm-hmm. I would say 9 times out of 10, that it's the opposite, in that, and this came up in a question the other day. Someone said, I know I have, or they didn't say what it was, but they said, I've tried EMDR, I've tried cranio, I've even done somatic experiencing, and every time my system blows up and I'm in terror. Yeah. And the moment I read that, I had the question for the person, did you have developmental trauma? Because that is indicative of developmental and early trauma. Because remember, when we are little, and I mean really little, like in utero, and this person had a near-death experience at 6 months in utero, which happens. You don't have cognitive understanding of what's going on. All you feel is complete terror, and I'm going to die. And the process of working with someone one-on-one, because it's what we would call normal, we might, as the participant, as the patient, the client, appease and stick with the person for that hour that we've paid them for. But if we don't have a map of how to follow our sensations and say this is enough, we may override and stay in that session. That's what creates the blow up of the nervous system. Yeah. So it doesn't mean that, let's say, that somatic experiencing practitioner wasn't skilled, but if they don't have the lens of the early trauma piece, because SE does not get into this. No. Peter can work with it, but he's his own person. The base level curriculum of somatic experiencing does not get into working with the intricacies of early trauma. That is where the work of Kathy Kane comes in, and that is part of Smart Body, Smart Mind. We aren't asking you about your traumas. We're not trying to get you to be stronger. We're getting you to sense the base level stress physiology and connect with it and feel it. So I wanted to add that in, because there is something unique about virtual, oddly, where, and I joke, you can shut your computer down when you've had enough and say, I've had enough, Irene, and literally walk away. You have a healthy boundary. Yeah. It's like, I'm done, and I just did 5 minutes, and that's cool. Yep. It's hard to do that when you've paid a therapist $200 to be in the room. It's hard to walk away when you've only been there for 3 minutes. But Seth knows, through working with people, he might see clients for a few minutes. That's it. And so I wanted to just add that little piece in. Yeah. Someone has a question here. Does SBSM touch on reparenting ourselves in inner child work or any internal family systems work, since that seems to be connected to inner child work? Or how are these aspects addressed with regards to regulating the nervous system? So we've skirted around that topic, but do you want to tackle that one specific to IFS?
Well, yeah. So that's, those parts, as they say, they are all related to nervous system states. That's what I discovered in myself and in my clients. Like, they may be saying, I'm really feeling, my 2-year-old part, Okay, and what I'm seeing is, okay, there's hypervigilance and collapse, and I'm seeing the physiology. So it's all of those internal senses of self, of my internal parent, my inner child, my teenager self. Those are all physiological states. If we are not just one whole person, if we are fragmented, as what happens with trauma, all of that can be reclaimed by working at this level of the felt sense. It's because that's how we contact them in this work. It's like, oh, I feel this, and then I have these impressions, and then I'm bringing it into my environment, and all of a sudden my environment looks different. It all is connected to these physiological states. Mm-hmm. So IFS and this work, they go well together. Mm-hmm. But I think you don't really need the IFS personally. I mean, it can be helpful to have that framework if you like, but it's all relatable, can be able to connect to that through this kind of exploration as well.
And then I'll add to that, what we're really working with, as Seth said, is you can develop a relationship and an attunement to yourself. So if you didn't have healthy attunement and attachment, you can't replicate that again with a parent. It's done. No. But you can do that as an adult with your cognitive brain, who's showing up and saying, I want to do this. So that's one thing. You have to want to do this. There has to be a little urge. It doesn't have to be rah urge, but a little urge. I think I want to do this. I want to try this out. And so the work that we're teaching is teaching you how to attune and notice your biological sensations and needs the way we wanted it to happen when you were young, but it didn't happen. Mm-hmm. We're teaching you, Seth had mentioned, the spaces in the body that hold energy and trauma and emotion that get shut down and collapse when he was talking about depression. We are teaching you how to connect with these spaces through self-touch, through intention, and through guidance. So in many ways, there is this, I don't like the word reparenting, but there's this reunion, this reconnection with your body in a way that maybe never happened. And some of the most basic touch lessons we'll see in our forums. I'm like, oh my God, you just had me touch my wrist and I'm a mess crying. And I feel so much tenderness. What the heck is this? It's like, that is what a mother, that's the touch that you probably wanted, and you've never felt that before. And you've maybe never even felt that from a practitioner who's done touch work with you, if they don't have this attunement to that early trauma. So it's very interesting when we get this stuff on board. A lot of these practices that are looking at certain things specifically, it all just kind of plunks into place like a Tetris game, right? It's like, poof, there's the foundation. So this is the next question I want to tackle. Can nervous system work help heal the results of narcissistic abusive parenting, which inflicts just as many psychological wounds as it does somatic? So the answer to that is yes. And Seth, take it away with how that shifts.
Well, yeah, I don't know if my dad would really be a classic narcissist, but certainly narcissistic tendencies for sure, enough to understand the gist very well. And yes, I mean, there may, and I don't want to poo-poo all other modalities too. Like there may be that there's a psychologist who really helps you understand yourself in a way that's super valuable, right? Like that can happen. But fundamentally, these psychological wounds, as you say, are physiological wounds. Right? They are fundamentally in your nervous system. There's what Kathy Kane calls the neurophysiological platform. It's a really great phrase. She says you cannot change the thoughts, you cannot change the psyche in a meaningful way without first addressing the underlying neurophysiological platform, because it is that platform that supports the kind of thoughts you're having in the first place. If you're in a regulated state, you're not going to have these psychological issues in the same way. What I've noticed for myself is that what happens is those psychological things, they become thinner. They become less urgent. They pull on the flesh less, is a way of putting it, where it's like an echo, right? So that's what I've noticed in myself. As I'm resolving the charges, I still get the same thought patterns, because those thought patterns are echoes of the physiological experience. They are generated fundamentally from what's happening in here. I think there's very few of us who actually are able to sit and just think creatively. Most of us don't really know how to, we haven't been able to use this thing up here for really what it's meant to, because it is stuck in responding to the survival state in the physiology, in the monkey mind, as we call it, right? All those thoughts and those self-judgments, self-thought, self-talk, negative, intrusive thought loops, all of that is generating from the physiological state. So as we resolve the physiological state, the mind stuff takes a little longer. That's what I've noticed. Like, but it's not alarming. Like oh yeah, I know that thought. That's related to this thing. And it's not pulling me into behavior, right? And that takes time, because the normal thing is you have the physiological state that produces this thought thing that leads you into a certain behavior or action, which then reinforces the physiological response, which then reinforces the brain, right? And it's a positive feedback loop with negative results. So what we're doing is we're breaking that loop at the place it has to be broken, which is the physiological level. When we just try to intervene with the mind, it's like trying to keep a freaking hamster in a box. Like, it's like, okay, you can pack it up for a while, but you got to get at the underlying chemistry, the underlying energy. So.
Yes. And it's the same with behavior change.
Same with behavior change.
Right. The
Absolutely.
same with of having the impetus to eat, to cook food, to exercise, to organize your house. I know it sounds like we're saying this is a panacea for everything, but when our nervous system is stuck in these survival energies, the rest is just kind of left, like it's co-opting us to see only survival or to be shut down and collapse. I'm going to shift a gear a little bit, because there might be some folks with this curiosity. Someone said, my system freezes when I do breath work. And I go into extreme parasympathetic shutdown when addressing shame, fear of being seen and getting bigger. Now, there's no question here, but knowing what we know about certain biohacks like breath work and even meditation, can you speak to what's going on in the system here, Seth?
Yeah. So what's going on there is just overstimulation. This is the problem with most breath practices, is they don't take into account what you're going to unearth, right? If you start using a certain breath practice that brings you into an area of the body that hasn't been inhabited before, oh yowza, like that's going to spike the system into total alarm. So that could show up as a freeze instantly, dissociation, checking out, feeling numb, or it could show up as massive activation and anxiety. Either way, it's because you're pushing on the system and it doesn't want to be pushed on. Like Irene said way back at the beginning, so much of this work, we think about what would you do with a baby? A baby can't do breath work. You can't say to an infant, okay, I want you to breathe in for 4 seconds and hold it for 8. And no, what? Right? And many of our wounds come from this place where we have no cognitive understanding. We can't, it doesn't, no compute, no make sense, right? There's no language even on board from some of these physiological states when they happened. So something like breath work is usually way too cathartic for anybody who has early developmental trauma, especially, or even just trauma later in life. We got to build the foundations of self-understanding, self-awareness, attunement, safety, all of these things. So we don't teach, I guess there's some things you could say in terms of the diaphragm works, where we explore some ways of using the breath to get into the body, but that's like week 8 or week 7. Like it's much later. We want to pay much more attention to things like, what is your breath doing, right? And actually, can you just be with that without trying to change it? And that's when we start to discover some very interesting things, like, oh my gosh, I wasn't breathing. Okay. Or, oh my gosh, my breath is super shallow. Interesting. What happens if I just pay attention to that? All right. So this work isn't about bringing in a big hammer and nail. It's about like discovering what's already happening in the structure, like what's already going on. Let's discover that in a way that's safe.
Thank you. There's two questions here that relate. So I'm going to read one of them and then the other, and then I'll test you, Seth, to see if we can blend them together. This is back to children and parenting. I'm in a very similar position with my partner's adult children. How might you do that differently with a 40-year-old child of a partner who does not know boundaries? So let's just start with that one, and then I'll go to the next one.
So, I mean, once your kids get past a certain age, it's like, okay, I say to many parents, like, it's a very common practice to have a college fund for your kid. Have a therapy fund instead. Have a somatic experiencing fund. Have a SBSM fund. It's because at a certain point, there's nothing you as a parent can do. You can except to support them getting the kind of help that they need. And they have to want to do it. Now, you can model boundaries at any point, and they don't have to like it. Like, that's something that you can do with your adult kids at any age. Have a boundary, put it up, enforce it. What happens? This is something that many adult kids have to do it's the flip side with their parents. Like, many people coming into this work in their 30s or their 40s realize, I don't actually want to talk to my mom for while I'm like, oh my gosh, every time I talk to her, I get triggered into these same activation states. And that's very normal actually for adult children to have put up boundaries with their parents, especially while they're going through this, and just say, hey, I can't talk to you for a while. I'm doing this work and I just need, so that boundaries can come in and be employed at any age. But if you have an adult kid who has a lot of, not a kid anymore, an adult person that you parented, that they were your child, and now they're an adult, well, it's like, okay, probably the best thing you can do is do your own work. Like I said, right? If you are, as a parent, feel there's stuff in you, like, you can change the field by doing your own work. You can model healthy boundaries. You can support them financially if possible, help them get the tools that they need to do their own work.
Thanks. And my sense is, and I'm just kind of psychically going into this question, it's possible too that this 40-year-old child is not independent. And I could see if one is needing parents because they haven't been parented well, and there's this conundrum because you now know that your adult child is suffering because they weren't taught boundaries. That's a tricky one.
That's tough. That's really tough.
So as a parent, you have to decide, do we want to leave this adult who's actually still a child neurologically to fend for themselves and hope they figure it out, or offer support with boundaries? And in many ways, a strict, this is what we're going to give you, and that is it. Yeah. Right.
That's generally I would say the best approach is support with boundaries.
Yeah. The next question, again, this was from what we were talking about a bit earlier. If I'm doing the work to regulate, but my partner is not, and he is also quite dysregulated by proxy, will the work I'm doing, is the work I'm going to do help, or I'm doing going to help? And I think it depends. So I don't know if you want to be a little to the point with that one, Seth.
Well, so this, we see in this work a lot of couples that break up. I mean, and a lot of people that find new love. I mean, they go together. It really very often is not sustainable. I'm just going to be straight up. Like, if you're doing the work to understand yourself, resolve your trauma, regulate your nervous system, and you're really excited about it, and you're doing this to embed your partner, and you can see all their stuff because now you're learning, and you see even more clearly, oh my God, they have all this going on, and they want nothing to do with it. That is usually not going to last. That's just how it is. Sometimes what can happen is they may get inspired. They may get inspired by you. They may get curious. They might notice that you're having changes, and they may get inspired to do the work themselves. That's what I see hardly ever, but sometimes that happens. Usually what happens is they become more defended, more resistant, more angry, critical, and it becomes more and more intolerable for the person who's trying to do the work. So.
Yeah. It's tough. Someone just said here, but I really like her. So my sense is there's someone here that sees that, and it's tough, right? It's like friends.
Yeah.
Like you will lose some people who you see their abusive patterns to themselves or to you, and you have to grieve. There needs to be a grieving process when some of these relationships have to split, because you are dedicated to your biological healing, and not everyone is going to connect with that. And it's tough.
It is tough. Yeah, it
Very
is really
tough.
There's very often a pruning that goes on as people get into this work, where it's just like they realize, okay, I see this relationship is formed out of that trauma pattern, and this one's reinforcing that trauma. Like our personality, when we grow up with trauma, our likes, our dislikes, what we, how we think about ourselves, what we want in our friendships, all of that is rooted in managing the trauma. So as we unpack the trauma and resolve it, who we are changes. And we often will realize, like, oh my gosh, this person isn't healthy for me. And it's not always like cut and dry. Like sometimes there's evolution. Sometimes you can talk with your friends or your partners and say, hey, I'm seeing this, and and there can be some evolution, but almost always there is this kind of pruning of relationships that happens, and sort of a disintegration of our understanding of ourself. Every client I've ever had, I think at some point says, like, I feel like I don't know who I am anymore. And that's when you're like, yes, all right, you're about to discover, my friend, who you are, because we all have that authentic nature within us. We all have an authentic self. And for all of us, there's a thread of that that will be present always. Like, it's not like you become a stranger, right? There's an essence to the self that is a continuous thread, but that essence just gets wrapped up in all these strategies and personalities and behaviors and whatever it may be that we need to do to try to keep feeling safe. And as we excavate that self, that authentic self, which is like precious gold, we start to realize, I really have to protect this. Like, this never was kept safe, and I have to do that now, right? So as that happens, we start to attract relationships that support it, and start to have no tolerance for relationships that do not.
Thanks. Okay, the next question really speaks to the title of our talk. So I'm going to bring this back up to the top. What are the signs and behaviors for a child when there's dysregulated parenting? I mean, kids cry sometimes, for example, and they still want to play, but it's bedtime. And how can you see your kid is in fight, flight, freeze mode?
Well, a lot of that does come to understanding that stuff in yourself. Like I always say before, you got to feel it in yourself to really see it accurately, or feel it in others. But there are certain things you can look for. I mean, if it's just like really explosive, wild energy that is just very uncontained, like a lot of the time, like it's normal for kids, especially young kids, to have big explosive outbursts and exuberance. That's great, but like we want to see a rhythm, right? Where it's like, okay, a peak and now we're chilling, right? But it's like, like all the time. Okay, that's some sympathetic dysregulation. Fight, flight is stuck in there. Or if they never are upset, right? Like, this is the classic thing of the baby who's left to cry themselves to sleep, and like, oh, it's working. They're quiet now. What a good baby. It's like, no, they're in freeze. They're in shutdown. They're in survival physiology. And that's, so if a kid is always quiet, restrained, doesn't ever express themselves, all that kind of stuff, this is a sign that there's freeze in the physiology. It's normal to have some levels of anxiety. It's normal to be a little nervous going into situations in like new school or something. But if it's so debilitating that it's like not doable, okay, that's a sign that there's some trauma here in the system that needs to be worked with. So you sort of want to look for these kinds of extremes that show us that there's something that's not just a regulation.
Yeah. And I'm going to add to that, I'm going to parallel an example. So often people will ask me, Irene, I do all the sleep hygiene. So this is an adult, but I get to bed and I'm like wired, and I've had the tea and the bath and I've turned off all the lights and nothing is stimulating me. Why can't I go to sleep? So that is there's stored survival stress, no doubt, in the system. Maybe it's from that day. Maybe it was really stressful. Typically, it's a lifetime of not knowing that it's there. And so I would often say, still do the sleep hygiene. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a nice thing to do. But we have to learn throughout the day, are we pushing and going and not acknowledging, man, I've got a lot of pent up stress, but I'm actually completely ignoring it because my behavior is survival based. With kids, again, it depends. Was there a birth trauma? Do they hate their teachers? The teacher really emotionally abusive, because sometimes that occurs. Are they not getting the proper nutrition? Right? Again, kids need good nutrition. They need protein and fat and all these things. They need to move and exercise. So if a kid is all of a sudden, it's quiet at home, I'm just going to paint the picture. And I know this is a hypothetical. Let's say mama's there, papa's there, they're there. And it's maybe this is the first time that day that the kid has your attention because you've been at work and it's been busy and go, go, go. And they want to play. They know it's bedtime, but it's like, I need to get my energy out. And you're finally here to connect with me. So rather than the fight that might happen of, because I've been in households where bedtime is a disaster, right? Or mealtime is a disaster. Can you find ways throughout the day to attune and connect with the kiddo so that they are being met always during the day, as opposed to what's so common in our culture? It's just this survival stress of doing. And then finally, when things are quiet at night, woof, I got all this. I need to show you me. I need you to connect with me. So that's something else to think about is, are there moments throughout the day where the kiddo is being allowed to express their maybe pent up survival energy from school? You know, some of my friends who have gone through Smart Body, Smart Mind, who have toddlers, they're like, oh my God, I see my kid totally different now. Every day after school, we don't just go home and do homework. I take him to the park and we run. We play catch, we do soccer, we go for a hike. I get him to climb a tree. If he looks a little depressed, I'm like, you know, let's do some animal sounds. She doesn't ask, what's wrong? What's wrong with you? You know, what happened today? Like, because he might not even know what's wrong, but let's play, right? Let's get this out.
This connects to a question I saw earlier, just was like examples for how to support kids' aggression.
Great.
You want to start this young, ideally, because play is the best way. Like when you can like get some like a toddler or a young kid who's still totally into using their imagination and playing pretend, like, okay, let's be big animals. What kind of dinosaur are you? I'm a triceratops, you know, rawr, rawr. What kind of sound do you make? How do you move? I stomp through the jungle, rah, rah, right? Like you can bring in this physicality and exuberance into play, which is a natural channel for their aggression. It's very easy to support that. If you do that early on enough, then that can just resolve so much. And then later, you know, if it's maybe later, you can talk about it a bit. Like if it's a kid who maybe is a little bit older, maybe you can explain to them a little bit about what you're noticing or about aggression, and you can work maybe like let's make some sounds together. You know, you can still bring it in. Even if they're too old for that sort of play, you could sort of talk about it a bit, maybe. Once they get into older teenager, they probably want nothing to do with it, right? But so it's like, that's where you get into the therapy fund kind of situation, you know. But there's a window up until I'd say around 12, 13, where you can do so much just by bringing in play, physical activity, and understanding these things about yourself.
Thanks. All right, this is a longer question, so I'm going to read it through here. And I don't know how you are for time, Seth. I know we have a thing to go to a little later, and Bonnie yourself too, but I'm happy to keep going through questions if you are, Seth.
Yeah, for now it's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm searching for a reason why, despite all kinds of parenting courses completed for parents and even professional ones and different types of therapies I went through, I just can't put into practice what I've learned. I go into most cases in fight responses and have a completely dysregulated nervous system myself. So in theory, this is the key word there, I know everything about my traumas, about peaceful, conscious parenting. That's a one we want to address, and how to react when my child is, for example, having a meltdown. But in practice, I fail many times. Would this course help me understand my dysregulation and teach me how to regulate myself so that I can better able regulate my child and not spill my emotions and anger onto them? So I'm going to say 100% yes.
Yep, that's what it's for.
again, we could call it a parenting course. There are so many parents that go through Smart Body, Smart Mind, and they will say, I had no clue how easy it was to parent.
Mm-hmm.
This is not a joke.
Yeah.
Children are not trying to be difficult. They're reacting to our inability to attune to them and play and meet their needs. Do you want to talk to, I want to address, where'd the word go here? Conscious and peaceful.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a thing that irks me a little bit
Mm-hmm.
because it's very hard, as I talked about before, to have healthy shame. So imagine if my dad or aggression
right?
saw me cutting with the knife to my face and came up to me, honey, don't do that. You're going to hurt yourself. I see some people laughing. This might piss some people off, but I'm being honest. That's not going to get through to little Irene. There needs to be a bit of a jolt, which we already talked about. Do you want to follow up just a little bit with that one, Seth?
Well, I mean, gosh, peaceful households, peace in general is a super valuable thing, but that's certainly not always reality.
Yeah.
Right? So if you're trying to impose a sense of peace onto a situation where that is not what's going on, that actually makes it more violent in some ways because it's misattuned and not responding to reality. It's almost like this weird kind of gaslighting where it's like you're almost telling the kid at that point you're not feeling what you're feeling because you need to be peaceful. And right, it's so, gosh, I mean, again, it's an ideal, it's nice, it sounds good, but it doesn't really often match well with the kinds of stressors that we experience in this world. Right.
Yeah.
It's much more peaceful holistically to meet the authenticity, right? Let's meet what's authentically happening. That is like, that's peace, like in a real way, right? And that may look very active, right?
I've said this before and I'll say it now for the record. I do not believe that any child should learn how to meditate and be mindful.
No.
It is built into them when they are met.
Yeah.
They will then concentrate and play with a doll or crayons or build a fort and be in their zone. But meditation is a higher level of consciousness training. It is very wonderful when you have the baseline physiology on board, but a child is learning about their baseline physiology. They're learning how to self-regulate. And my God, if they're raging because their teacher just screamed at them and they froze, the last thing you want to do to that little kid is say, I need you to let's sit quietly with mommy.
Yeah.
Oh,
close your eyes.
Give them a phone book and let them rip it apart like it's the teacher's head. I'm dead serious here.
Yeah.
And Seth, I know, has worked with kiddos who have had severe traumas, and oh my goodness, like the stuff that he might have to do to help a little one get their survival physiology is intense. Yeah. And even the parents are like, oh, like even one of our instructors, Steve Terrell, who only works with kids and his practice is closed, so you can't see him, but he's like, I've had kids bite me. Like I'll be sitting on the table working with their brainstem and they'll come out of freeze and they'll literally take a chomp out of his arm. And the parents are horrified. And he's like, stop. Like this is exactly what we want. And so this is, again, why knowing this information as you, the parent, and being able to handle these big emotions and actions are so important. One person asked, is it necessary to delve into your past to understand where your trauma originates to work through it? Not necessarily. Yeah,
your past, it'll happen naturally. We don't go in through the story hardly ever. There's a specific form of work where sometimes we use the story and slow it way down as a cue to get into the body. But generally what we do is we work with what's happening now, because the past is here now. When you've been through trauma, it will arise on its own. It will be revealed to you. You don't have to go in through this story or try to figure it out. You'll maybe like say, like I said, that one thing, like I was exploring an area of my lung, and then, oh my gosh, here's this memory of this grief that arises from the physiology. That's like, oh, and then I have some understanding. about what this is related to, but you don't have to go looking for it. No.
And sometimes there's no story.
And sometimes there is no story.
When
That's
it's
the thing.
pre-verbal.
Yeah, when it's early developmental trauma, in utero, infancy, toddlerhood, there is no story because the brain's not making stories yet. It's just experiencing. There's often no emotion. That can be a really wild thing when you get into those layers where there's intense sensation, but no emotion, because we don't understand emotion yet. When we're developing, we don't have emotions in the normal sense because there's no context or relation, right, to what's happening. It's just, I'm feeling this, I'm experiencing these sensations. So yeah, those types of things absolutely can happen where you're just like, wow, this big experience is going through and I have no idea what it's about, but I'm just going with it. Right?
Yeah. It's like when you touch a slug or an animal that's not a vertebrate and they retract, they coil, or a cell. That's what's occurring with early trauma. It's like, oh, I have to protect, I have to contract. I want to get to this next question. How do you tell your child that you have PTSD? Then the second follow-up, is there a simple somatic gesture practice touch that one can do to oneself or with the child to be able to stay present and feel safe when the little child triggers you? So I'm going to say one thing and then you can take the rest. I'm going to say what you want to do is learn how to be with your physiology and grow your capacity. That's the bigger answer. Because when you have that, you will be able to contain what you're feeling and be with it internally, resource to yourself internally. And then there's no need to say what's happening because you're just moving through it with your kiddo. Do you want to tackle the other part of that question, Seth?
The first part was, you don't need to tell your kid you have PTSD. You want to learn to be with it on your own. Now, as they get older, it may be important to sometimes communicate, some of where you're coming from, if they ask, right? But it's not something I would necessarily volunteer.
Not to a young child.
Not to a young child,
no.
Absolutely not. And this is a tough thing. This is actually an important point because we talk a lot about authenticity. Sometimes as a parent, you actually can't be with your kid. Like you have to put your authenticity on hold for their sake and attend to yourself later. It's not safe. Like for a young developing kid, we don't want to let our rage move through. We do not want to let our intense grief move through. That's way too intense for them. And what will happen is they will feel like they have to take care of us, which sets up a very problematic dynamic, which many people experience later in life, where they feel like they have to take care of everybody for them to be okay, right? So it's important to remain contained and have capacity to develop those things within yourself as a parent. Now, what the other piece was about touch?
I addressed that. Yeah, we got through that one. It was about, is there a way that I can be with myself, connect to myself so that I'm not triggering, is there an action, a practice that I can do when I'm feeling? And that comes down to what I said before.
You have to develop you have to do the work. Yeah, there's no one specific, that's the thing about this work. It's not like this tool solves this problem. It's about developing a vocabulary. I'm a musician, so the way I talk about it a lot is like, you got to learn your scales in order to improvise. You have to put in a lot of rudimentary work to get all the skills in the muscle memory, and then you can respond spontaneously. And that's exactly what this work is. It's not like you do this practice to solve this problem. You learn an entire world of self-knowledge and self-practices and techniques and tools, and all of that then is in you, and you respond organically as needed to each situation. And we never know exactly what that will look like. So, yeah.
Question, and I'll answer this. Can our fascia become hardened and affected from trauma? 100%. Yes. And can this work here release the tension? Yes. Yep. Again, like Seth said, it's not going in and manipulating the tissue. It's about working with the entirety of the system, the totality of the system, so that the survival stressors aren't putting out the signal constantly to brace. And then also within this fascial tension, it can be in the muscles, it can be in the fluids, it can be in the bone. it can be in the organs, it can be all of these things. We're slowly building capacity so that we can connect with these things and start to move them out of our system.
Yeah, and that brings up an important point, is that that fascia is tense for a reason, right? So again, like a classic approach might be to go in and manipulate it to get it to release, but you have to ask, well, why is it protecting? What is it protecting? Is the system as a whole ready to release what it is protecting? Right? All of those things have to be addressed, which is why when we work with the fascia in this program, it's a very it's not about manipulating the tissue. It's about paying attention and listening. That being said, once a person has a lot of this on board and ability to emote and all that stuff and connect to what's happening, it can be super helpful to get like deep myofascial work. But it has to be with a practitioner who like you feel safe with, that you can like allow stuff to move through, the emotions, the sounds, whatever that may come through. Right? I almost punched my massage therapist in the face the other day because he got into my jaw and like I couldn't restrain my fight response. Like I was just like, ah! I had to let my arms go, and we laughed, and this is someone I've seen for years, so it's safe, right? So yeah, the way we start is not at all like that. It's very, very gentle and intention based. Yeah.
I'll add to that, and I'll get to the next question. When we do have things that require body work, for example, having this on board will transform how your system integrates that body work. Having done body work with people through the Feldenkrais method, I mean, I know my earlier years before I had this on board, I was not that I wasn't doing a service to the person, they were finding a nice movement, but there wasn't that attunement to the pacing, the listening. And when you can be in your body and sense these things, it falls into place and integrates so much better. So one question here, it's a bit more logistical. How much deeper dive does SPSM go than your 21-day nervous system tune-up? I'm a biopsychology student who's done numerous therapies. I'm in ketamine assisted IFS therapy, and I'm starting to improve. I did the 21-day tune-up, and it was easy work for me as I've been practicing and familiar with the modalities. How do I know if it's for me if I already understand the biology and have changed with these other processes? I'm progressing with other modalities. 21 days was difficult to afford, and I'm worried SPSM stuff is something I've already learned. So I'll say that I never want anyone to go into these programs if it's going to mean that you can't feed yourself, feed your children, pay your bills. So there needs to be that. I don't want to push anyone if they can't financially truly make it work over the course of, say, the year, because there's also a payment option. The difference, I'll just say that the differences between the two is SPSM goes much deeper into working with the stress physiology, because we're working with the stress organs, the kidneys, the adrenals, the brainstem, the gut, the fascia, the layers, the joints, the diaphragms. There's more Feldenkraisian teaching, more neurodifferentiation. There's the training calls with me that do go into the theory of the biology of stress, but I go a little deeper. Seth does Q&A calls, and as you can tell, he knows his stuff, and we work a little differently in explanation, but he's also there. It's just a much more robust course. That's mostly what I can say. The elements of early trauma and developmental trauma that I mentioned that we work with is not in the 21 days. It's in SPSM, just because you need that time. The other thing in Smart Body, Smart Mind is we work with healthy aggression, and we get into that. So much more vagus nerve. We could call it toning. I don't love that word, but we are working with sound in a different way. Can you think of anything else to add to that, Seth?
I think that's mostly it. Yeah, the early developmental stuff, working with the layers, working with the stress organs, working with aggression, the more in-depth education with the live lectures with you, the Q&A calls with me are different. There's also all the movement stuff. Our colleague Elia has all of his movement lessons, which he's from a Tai Chi dance, Qigong dance background. So that's a whole nother level of stuff that's in there. Those are most of the differences, I'd say.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, if it's feeling like a stress, or like, don't worry about it. Like, do it,
Yeah.
maybe do it next year, or like if you're having
Mm-hmm.
good progress with the therapy you're doing, like stick with it,
Mm-hmm.
no
Yeah.
pressure. It's like,
Yeah.
we're here. We'll keep doing it, we'll keep
Yeah.
learning
Go
it.
with your gut. Go with your gut.
Yeah.
Another logistical, how many hours per week should one dedicate to this course to go through the weekly materials and daily practices? Is it a lot for parents is the question.
Mhm.
So, on average, it might be 4 hours a week, give or take. But again, it's about pacing yourself.
Yeah.
I call it like a university semester for your nervous system, but it's different than university. And that if you don't, there's no assignments,
Yeah, no
there's no
testing.
home, there's no testing. Of course, I want you to do the work and do little bits, but it should be taken in a way that that doesn't add more stress. And everything is recorded. Everything is transcribed, the live calls. And so some people will take a year or two to go through it. Some people will just work with the first few modules in the first 6 months. So again, some people have more time, other people don't. And we've had single moms go through this and figure out a way to do little bits when they can. And it's just about moving ahead and progressing in increments that make sense for you.
Yeah.
All right.
And if you do want to see a complete, go to the FAQ page.
Right.
You go to Smart Body, Smart Mind, there's an FAQ link at the top. And in there's a breakdown of all the hours and that are needed. Yeah, all the different stuff. Yeah.
Next question. What if I know and feel that having less contact with my parents, especially my mom, would be good for me, but setting boundaries with her and them feels too dangerous, even life-threatening on a certain level? Could you speak to that?
That's how it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. You have to start.
Yeah.
Don't look for it to feel easy to do. It's never going to feel easy to do until you do it. Setting a boundary with a parent that you need space from in order to do this work is extremely common. And it's not going to be easy. So you just got to try. I mean, one thing I'd like you to encourage you to consider, know that the feeling that I feel like I'm going to die if I do this, yes, that's normal. That's the trauma response. So that's not something to base your decision on. Okay. That's just what's going to happen. Also, maybe think about the fact that your parents should want you to do whatever you need to do to be okay. And if they don't support you in holding a boundary for yourself so you can heal, that's even more of a reason to do it.
I will say to that, I have a video that I made a while ago that's titled, Why We Can All Heal, But Not Everyone Will.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of a punchy title there. And I remember a student commented on it quite a while ago who said, I am that person who will never heal because I can't let go of taking care of my mother, who is my abuser.
Yep.
And she made a conscious decision. I'm going to keep doing this because she just couldn't separate. It was too hard. And that's her decision to make.
Yep.
If a parent is really doing the act of keeping us from being authentic and healing, you've got to question where is that coming from? It's probably not because they don't truly want you to be better. They just don't know how to act any differently because their trauma is still probably running the front of their bus. Yep. And so that's where it will be tricky because you'll feel these intense things. It's your family system. The person brought you into the world. Of course, it's going to be hard. And that's the other thing. Working with survival stress isn't always easy. There's a reason we hid it in our bodies for our entire life. So part of the process is feeling stuff that might not be that comfortable, but we guide you through doing that through resources and pacing and all those sorts of things.
Yeah.
If one child is expressing a ton of anger, but it stresses the other child of the same age, is it okay to have the child who isn't expressing go to her room while the meltdown is happening and tend to her after the meltdown has subsided?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Consciously, it's why you're doing it.
Yeah.
Right. Versus screaming to the child, get to your room. Right. It's like, come on, let's keep you safe. And I'm going to be with your brother, sister.
Yeah. And let them know I will be in here afterwards to be with you and check on you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is a comment. I'll just address it. Pent up survival energy after school. Is that natural, or does that mean we need to reevaluate our schools? Yes, we do.
Yes, and yes. It's a natural response to a toxic system.
I think that, again, Gabor Mate speaks about this, and other people do. The way that we teach our children is absolutely ridiculous. And I think there's a reason why more and more parents are homeschooling their kids. The thing that I worry a little bit about is that there's not enough structure in the homeschool world, because I have seen that go sideways, where there isn't enough rules and there isn't enough, you got to get this done. Because in the real world, sometimes you have to get stuff done. And that's very important.
Yeah, it's a fine line between the really toxic current sort of normal industrialized school system. And then like you guys living where how I did, like in sort of the hippie community for 15 years, like I've seen shit go way off the rails in the other direction, where there's like no structure, nothing happening, no learning is going on, right? So I think our entire school system has to be completely redesigned from the ground up. Homeschooling is probably a better option for now. And yeah, it's if your kids having all this aggression after school, it's like, yes, support them in getting that out, because they're responding naturally.
This is an interesting one, so I'm going to read it. I grew up on frozen Hot Pockets, Lunchables, microwave dinners, and never got the proper nutrition my body needed. I think Seth and I both know that. But also consumed a lot of chemicals. Does this count as trauma to the body, and can that be healed through this work? Yes. My story is very similar to this. Yes, I don't know how I survived Kraft dinner and hot dogs and all the things. And I was also exposed to a lot of chemicals growing up. That is my trauma: in utero, developmental, even transgenerational. I grew up in an animal hospital where my parents had me and they didn't bathe me in chemicals, but I was around them. I was working at this clinic. And in addition to the trauma work, there was also detoxing I had to do with specific things. We can link that in the chat, but it sometimes requires a little more work than just the nervous system work to get these chemicals out of our body. So yes. And when we have more attunement to our nervous system, we know that there's actually something there to work with. Very important. But nutrition is very important. Okay. I'm currently not teaching in person these days. Hopefully we'll get to that at one point. Again, I used to teach a lot in person up until 2019. All right. What to look for in practitioners? Seems this competence on your level is hard to find outside of the US. You are correct.
It's hard to find in the US.
And it's hard to find in the US and Canada. Is SBSM the best realistic option internationally? Yes. So this is going to stroke our egos a little bit, but I was really fortunate to get into working in the somatic experiencing world when I did. Peter Levine was still doing a lot of master classes, and I was able to assist at those levels. Kathy Kane and Stephen Terrell, who taught both of us the early trauma work, they were in full force, kind of in many ways in their prime. Of course, everything we did was in person, thank God. I am worried about all the online learning in these trainings. I think you can learn a lot online, but to teach a practitioner, I'm not so sure. And then the other thing that's starting to happen is, because the nervous system is becoming a hot topic, a lot of people are going into these trainings wanting to just get the badge. And by that, I mean, they just want it on their website. I've trained in SE, I've trained in this. So again, it depends on the person, depends on whether or not they've done their own work. Do they actually understand the work? Peter has said that only about, what was it?
10%.
10% of the people that go through the SE trainings that he sees actually get it. And so SE and this work we're doing is not a method, it's not an approach. It might seem that way, but it goes back to the kiddos. We're really wanting to teach a human how to be in their bodies, attuned to themselves in the world, and how that happens. it's a bit of a dance. But yeah, smart body, smart mind. Again, it's not just somatic experiencing, it's the early trauma work. And it's also the Feldenkrais methodologies that I'm trained in and steeped in heavily together. Anything that you want to add to that, since you see a lot of people that have gone through smart body, smart mind, Seth?
Yeah. So one, yeah, finding a practitioner who really knows how to do this work. They're out there for sure. But in relation to the amount of need, they're like a needle in a haystack, because almost everyone in the industrialized world is traumatized to one degree or another. And we all need this work. So finding a practitioner who really knows how to do it can be difficult. If you find one, that's awesome. In terms of what to look for, which I believe you asked, like, well, do you feel like they get you? Do you feel that sense of being attuned to? Do you know what that even means to start, right? Because so many times our experiences in therapy are being met at the mind level or confronted, or right. A practitioner who really knows how to do this work has to have done their work, because in this modality, you can only take someone as far as you yourself have gone, because you are the one, as the practitioner, who is providing the template for that other person's system. So if you don't have that regulation in yourself, you're not going to be able to help your client have it and develop it. So it's hard to find all of that. If you do find someone who feels like, you feel like they get you and you're feeling like met, you also want, like, they should be able to tell you a rough sort of idea of what they're going to do. Like, this is what I'm thinking we need to do. I think we should work on this, and we're going to do this for this reason, right? They should, if they tell you that you're going to be all better in any X amount of time, then run far away, because that is not good. They don't know how long it's going to take. And if they say they do, then they're fooling themselves. So those are some things. But yeah, all the clients that I've had the most success with have done either the 21 days or SBSM first, because then they come into the sessions already knowing so much about themselves, and I don't have to explain some of the basic principles and teach it to them. They already know. So we can get into really effective work, like, pretty quickly. Yeah. So I think it's definitely the best option internationally, unless you're blessed enough to live near or have access to a really skilled and attuned practitioner.
And that was how I created SBSM. I was in private practice, and I was finding that, the cost is interesting, because there were some people that had worked with me for up to 3 years, once a week. Do the math. That's a lot at $200 a session, because that's what we have to charge in this city. And I felt like I was just not getting to where I knew people could get to. So I started creating homework lessons for them. I started creating a PowerPoint presentation so that they could learn the theory. And then one thing led to another. I'm like, we just need to put this in an online space. And so while I'm not in private practice now, I appreciate how some people might need that, but man, it's like exercise. You can't get fit by just seeing a trainer once a week. You have to do something every day. You can't just eat one healthy meal once a week. While that's still a good thing to have, you need to keep doing this. Just like when I go back to the kids, if you have an infant, you can't be attuned to them once a week. Right? So when you're trying to relearn this for yourself, you really need to take this on more so as a study and as a learning practice than going in and saying, I'm going to fix all my trauma. That tends to be less. We really try to say to folks, we want you to see this as a learning shift. You're learning how to learn again. And then with time, because the system wants to get rid of these things, or it wants to find safety, it will eventually find safety. And I have impacted way more people with my online work than when I was in private practice, because people are getting that consistency and that practice over and over again. And yeah, I was told that it wouldn't work by many high-level folks. And not to say that it's for everyone, but we have the template in our body to learn this stuff.
Yeah. And one thing I'll say, and just the final thing about the therapeutic relationship, I've written an article about how, it's not there's no specific tools or techniques that heal trauma. It's about relationship. So that may sound contradictory to what we're saying here, but the thing is, you can develop that therapeutic relationship with yourself. It's something that you can give to yourself. And you may find that it'd be useful at some point to connect with another practitioner. That's awesome. But if you can first develop that with yourself, man, what a leg up you have. And many people, it's enough. Like there's been many people who've gone through these programs and they didn't need one-on-one work. They got better just from doing this and becoming their own practitioner, becoming their own safe person, right?
Yeah, I would say that your relationships at home are very important. If you are still living in a very abusive, toxic environment in your home life, that doesn't mean that you can't make progress, but eventually
you're gonna have to stop.
You're gonna have to shift something. A job that's toxic, I've actually worked with some folks where we've actually used the toxic job as a way for them to learn about themselves and then and set boundaries, and then eventually they do leave. But they have kids, they need to make money, they can't just quit on a whim. So it's like, let's work with this, right? But those who I have found do succeed, I don't want to say quicker, but maybe with a little more ease, even if they have severe complex PTSD. Isabel, we talked to yesterday on a live, one of our students, she has a loving husband. There's a good, wholesome relationship. There's food in the fridge. They have a home. So her basic needs have been met. And she even said, I have an ACE score of 9 out of 10, tons of abuse growing up, tons of complex PTSD. But because she, A, wants to do the work, B, has a safe environment, literally, and C, is going at her own pace, she was able to make some pretty big shifts quite quickly. Okay, we're at 2 hours. So I'm very tempted to say we got to call it because I have to pee. But I know that there's a few other questions. We got through most of them. Okay. And in seeing some of the questions, the answer all comes down to grow your own nervous system regulation, whether it's through us and the course that's about to start next week. Wonderful. If it's through going through more of my free resources on my site, please use those as opposed to going onto YouTube and finding some quick hacks to tone the vagal nerve. I did a talk on biohacking a couple of days ago. If you didn't see that one, please watch that, because I do have some gentle audio lessons that you can start with. The 21-day nervous system tune-up is another way that you can begin. But at the end of the day, we want to have this capacity back. We want to build self-regulation. And when we have that, the world just looks a little clearer and a little safer, as do the people in it. And we understand people a little bit better. So thank you, everyone, for being here. We still have 125 people on the line after 2 hours. This will be recorded. Obviously, it'll be uploaded to YouTube. Seth, any final words that you would like to say to the people?
Well, you can do it. You can do it. I'm living proof. I'm not like special. I'm just a human. And I went from being a scared, anxious, hippie, couldn't deal with society, to being here with you and teaching and sharing this information and working with clients and feeling safe in the world. It's possible. It's not an unreachable goal. You can absolutely do it. So I encourage you to feel into your gut, feel into your body. What do you feel pulled to do? Are you feeling a pull to try out this work with us? If so, listen to that. If it doesn't feel like the right time, then listen to that, right? Just go with your impulse, listen to your body, and just know that you have the ability to heal. It's in you. You just need the right support, the right information, right tools. And yeah, we're here for you if you want to join us. It'd be great to have you.
Thank you for being here. Again, it's been a journey getting to this point of having this course where it is. As a reminder, this is the 12th time we've run it. We've refined it in a way that I'm very happy with, and it's shifting lives all around the world. I do feel that this is the way forward, that we get this stuff in our bodies, in our brains, in our minds,
and we shift our system so that we can shift the world around us. So thank you, everyone, one more time. And we start the course next week with orientation on Thursday. And yeah, we'll get into the training really, really soon. Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
Bye,
Seth.
everybody. Mwah. Thanks so much for being here.